Hi, I'm Dr. Chris Stevens, and this is the Psychology to Live By podcast. One of the most important things in the modern workplace is our ability to skillfully conduct difficult conversations. So this is the first of 3 videos on this topic. The first explores what's actually happening. The second, how I better manage myself. And the third, how I better manage others in these tricky situations. When we interact with others, our bodies read and react to the other person's physiological state. And a long-standing finding is that communication at these chemical and visceral levels far outweighs the verbal levels. And all of this, of course, is mediated by our brain and nervous system. And a fundamental question for survival is always, is the other person a friend or a foe? So when we feel safe, we access the prefrontal cortex, which is the executive of our brain. And typically the neurotransmitters oxytocin, dopamine, serotonin are in an ideal balance and will want to bond and collaborate. In this condition, interactions with others become we-centric, characterized by trust, growth, and exploration. Before the prefrontal cortex has access, however, our danger or threat system has already done its quick and dirty appraisal of the world. Is this a friend or foe? If a foe, our amygdala and our limbic system kick into action. And they have a very I-centric inward focus. Within a second, they can shut down our frontal lobes, and high levels of cortisol, norepinephrine, too much dopamine and testosterone can lead to fear and aggression. And this activates the sympathetic fight-flight nervous system. In such conditions, we find it hard to trust, to think, and to interact constructively. Now, if this were to happen, we would ideally use conversational intelligence to positively influence our own and other people's neurochemistry, so we can access our prefrontal cortex and thereby have a much better chance to engage our higher level intelligences involving trust, integrity, empathy, and good judgment. So, a fundamental task in preparing for and engaging in difficult conversation is figuring out what's actually going on for me and for the other person. Generally, in a state of low trust, the person assumes the other person is threatening and will conclude it's safest to be resistant and skeptical, and the interaction will be transactional, if not downright oppositional. If the person's feeling conditional trust, they're concluding there's not enough evidence that they're safe. So they're in a wait-and-see mode, and the interaction will be about influencing and persuading. And in conditions of high safety and trust, we assume we're safe and conclude this is an opportunity for experimentation and co-creativity, which of course allows the conversation to be transformational. Now generally, if you recognise the state that you and the person are in, and there's a gap between that state and the ideal state for that situation, this gap analysis will tell you what you need to try to do. So, for example, if you find you're being defensive, territorial, reactive, you need to disengage and then re-engage. You need to recognise that there's this mismatch and you need to reframe the situation, perhaps as one where you need to listen more openly or notice what the other person's needs are. And then you can refocus your attention and redirect your actions accordingly. And when you do that, you're in the position to then help the other person usefully shift their state. So, for example, if you're thinking, I'm not open to your view, or I don't think I can trust you, your inner state may be closed and reactive, and you'll probably outwardly appear pretty closed to others or even rigid. Or if you inwardly feel uncertain and are waiting for evidence, you're probably not contributing as positively to the conversation as you could, and likely you're going to appear doubtful and judgmental. So the first step is to recognise that you need to be more constructive. Unfortunately, we're not this objective about such difficult situations. The general problem we all have to deal with as humans is avoidance. Very often our cost-benefit analysis around shifting state and shifting how we're viewing and being in a situation is from the very beginning biased. And it's frequently biased because we lack the confidence the skills in conversational intelligence would provide us. Our fear of feeling uncomfortable or even threatened means we're motivated in the short term to avoid the situation or the conversation. And this, of course, is known as avoidance coping. This avoidance coping gives us an immediate sense of control. Now, sometimes it might be prudent or even wise, but more commonly, it's a classic short-term thinking. It's akin to procrastination. The problem doesn't go away, and typically it's going to get bigger. Examples of avoidance coping abound. Complaining, gossiping, procrastination, passive aggression, rumination, resentment, pleasure-seeking, drinking, eating, drugs, addictions, even being overly nice. I could go on. But the question is, what's the answer to avoidance coping? Well, there are two general answers that we're going to cover in the next session. The first is approach coping. This is where we change our mental frame, or we shift our behaviours, or we shift how we're feeling. In other words, we proactively address the problem. The second answer is emotional intelligence, the first step of which is to become aware of our own emotions and then shift them to emotions that are more helpful. In any case, we'll come back to these two broad strategies in the next session on how I better manage myself using conversational intelligence in difficult conversations. You've been listening to the Psychology to Live By podcast. If you'd like to know more, my website is www.drchris.life. And if you like the podcast, share it with people you like so they can like it too.